The smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee hung heavy in the October air as Rachel Brown pushed through the glass door of Miller's Diner, the familiar chime of the entrance bell marking what would be her final recorded moment inside a public establishment. It was 9:47 p.m. on October 15, 1979, and the 17-year-old had just finished her shift at the local pharmacy, her white sneakers still bearing traces of the antiseptic floor cleaner she'd mopped with hours earlier. The diner sat like a beacon of yellow light against the vast darkness of Highway 180, its neon sign flickering intermittently, casting ghostly shadows across the empty parking lot that stretched toward the cotton fields of Fresno County. Sarah Martinez had been waiting in the corner booth they always shared, nursing a cherry coke and picking at a basket of fries that had long since gone cold. The two girls had been inseparable since middle school, bonding over their shared dreams of escaping their small farming community for the bright lights of Los Angeles or San Francisco. Rachel slid into the cracked vinyl seat across from her best friend, her shoulder-length auburn hair catching the harsh fluorescent light as she leaned forward to whisper about the college brochures hidden beneath her mattress at home. Her parents, devout members of the local Baptist church, believed a woman's place was in the home, not pursuing higher education in some distant city filled with moral corruption and dangerous strangers. The conversation that night carried an unusual urgency. Rachel had been accepted to UC Davis with a partial scholarship, but the deadline for her response was approaching rapidly. She pulled out a crumpled letter from her purse, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed it against the scarred formica table. The fluorescent bulb above their booth hummed and flickered, creating an almost strobe-like effect that would later haunt Sarah's memory. Rachel spoke in hushed tones about her plan to leave Fresno County forever, to study biology and maybe become a veterinarian, to build a life beyond the suffocating expectations of their rural community. At 10:23 p.m., the girls finished their conversation and walked toward the parking lot together. The night air carried the scent of almond blossoms from nearby orchards, mixed with the diesel fumes from the occasional 18-wheeler that rumbled past on the highway. Sarah's rusty Chevelle was parked directly under one of the 3 functioning streetlights, while Rachel's beat-up Honda Civic sat in the shadows near the diner's back corner, closer to the employee entrance she'd used during her brief stint as a weekend waitress the previous summer. The two friends embraced beneath the flickering light, Rachel's jean jacket soft against Sarah's cheek as they promised to talk again before school the next morning. Sarah watched from her car as Rachel walked across the parking lot, her figure gradually disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the streetlights. The sound of Rachel's footsteps on the gravel faded into the night, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the methodical chirping of crickets in the adjacent fields. Sarah started her engine and pulled onto Highway 180, glancing once in her rearview mirror to see the Honda still sitting motionless in the shadows. She assumed Rachel was probably sitting in her car for a few minutes, gathering courage for the conversation she planned to have with her parents about college. It was a decision that would torment Sarah for the rest of her life. When Rachel failed to arrive home by her 11 p.m. curfew, her parents initially attributed it to teenage rebellion. But as the hours stretched into dawn and their daughter's bed remained empty, panic began to set in. Her Honda Civic was found the next morning, keys still in the ignition, her purse lying on the passenger seat with $23 untouched in her wallet. The only signs of struggle were faint scuff marks in the gravel and a small tear in the back fence that separated the parking lot from the cotton field, as if someone had been dragged through the opening under cover of darkness. Deputy Tom Walsh had been working the night shift for Fresno County Sheriff's Department for less than 2 years when the call came in about Rachel Brown's disappearance, but he approached the case with the methodical determination of a veteran investigator. The morning sun cast long shadows across Miller's Diner parking lot as Walsh crouched beside Rachel's abandoned Honda. his weathered hands carefully documenting every detail with a battered Polaroid camera that had seen too many crime scenes. The scuff marks in the gravel told a story of violence, but without proper forensic equipment, Walsh could only rely on his instincts and the basic investigative training he'd received at the academy in Sacramento. The bloodhounds arrived from the state police barracks in Modesto, their handler explaining that the dogs had successfully tracked missing persons across hundreds of miles of California wilderness. But something was different about this case. The German shepherds picked up Rachel's scent from her car and followed it across the parking lot, their noses pressed to the ground as they traced an erratic path toward the back fence. The trail led through the torn opening in the chain link, across 50 yards of freshly tilled cotton field, and then simply vanished at the edge of Highway 180. The handler, a gruff man named Peterson, who had worked with search dogs for 20 years, shook his head in bewilderment. The scent trail didn't fade gradually as it would if Rachel had walked away on her own. It ended abruptly, as if she'd been lifted from the earth and carried away. Walsh spent the next 72 hours interviewing every person who might have seen Rachel on that October night. The diner's night manager, a heavy-set woman named Dolores Quinn, remembered serving the two girls but hadn't paid attention to the parking lot activity. A long-haul trucker named Jimmy Santoro recalled seeing a young woman walking toward a small car around 10:30, but the details were frustratingly vague. The highway patrol had recorded no accidents or incidents on that stretch of road, and the nearest gas station attendant had been dealing with a broken pump and hadn't noticed any unusual traffic. Michael Fisher became the inevitable focus of the investigation, not because of evidence, but because small-town logic demanded a suspect. The 18-year-old had been dating Rachel for 8 months, and their relationship had grown increasingly strained as she talked more seriously about leaving for college. Friends described heated arguments about their future together, with Michael becoming possessive and jealous as graduation approached. But his alibi was solid, verified by 3 witnesses who placed him at a house party 15 miles away, drinking beer and playing pool until well past midnight. Walsh's instincts told him Michael wasn't involved, but the pressure from Rachel's parents and the community demanded that every angle be explored. The investigation revealed the limitations of rural law enforcement in 1979. The sheriff's department lacked the resources for extensive forensic analysis, relying instead on the state crime lab in Sacramento, where evidence could sit for months before being processed. The torn piece of Rachel's jacket, found 3 weeks later near the irrigation canal, had been trampled by cattle and contaminated by rain, making it useless for the crude blood-typing tests available at the time. Fingerprints lifted from her car matched only Rachel herself and Sarah Martinez, providing no leads toward an unknown perpetrator. As autumn turned to winter, the case began to consume Walsh's personal life. He worked 16-hour days, following leads that invariably led nowhere, interviewing drifters and transients who passed through Fresno County with disturbing regularity. His wife complained that he talked about Rachel Brown more than his own family, that he spent more time with crime scene photographs than with his 2 young children. The weight of the unsolved case pressed down on the entire community like a suffocating blanket, transforming their quiet farming town into a place where parents no longer let their teenagers walk alone after dark, where every stranger was viewed with suspicion, where the simple act of driving past Miller's diner became a reminder of how quickly innocence could vanish into the vast darkness of the Central Valley night. The Brown family's modest 2-bedroom house on Elm Street became a shrine to their missing daughter, every surface displaying photographs of Rachel from infancy through her final school portrait, taken just 6 weeks before she vanished. Linda Brown transformed her kitchen table into a makeshift command center, covering it with missing person flyers, newspaper clippings, and a detailed map of Fresno County marked with red pins, indicating every location where someone claimed to have seen a young woman matching Rachel's description. The telephone became her lifeline to hope, its shrill ring at any hour causing her heart to race with the possibility that this call would finally bring news of her daughter's whereabouts. Every October 15th, Linda organized vigils at Miller's Diner, watching the crowd of supporters dwindle year after year as the community's attention shifted to fresher tragedies and more immediate concerns. The first anniversary drew over 200 people, their candles flickering against the darkness as Pastor Williams from the Baptist Church led prayers for Rachel's safe return. By the 5th anniversary, fewer than 30 people gathered in the same parking lot where Rachel had last been seen, their faces weathered by time and diminished expectations. Linda stood beside the same streetlight where Sarah Martinez had watched her daughter disappear, clutching a photograph and speaking to a reporter from the Fresno Bee who had covered the story since its beginning. The financial strain of maintaining a private investigation nearly bankrupted the family. Robert Brown, who worked as a mechanic at the county highway department, took on weekend jobs to pay for private investigators who promised results but delivered only expensive disappointments. Linda sold her grandmother's jewelry and her own wedding china to fund reward money that grew from $5,000 to $25,000 over the years, but the tips that trickled in led nowhere. Psychics called regularly, claiming to have visions of Rachel trapped in underground tunnels or held captive in distant states. But their elaborate theories crumbled under scrutiny, leaving the family more devastated than before. The Browns' marriage began to fracture under the weight of unresolved grief. Robert retreated into silence, spending increasingly long hours in his garage workshop, methodically restoring vintage automobiles while avoiding conversations about their daughter. Linda became consumed by conspiracy theories, convinced that law enforcement was covering up evidence, or that powerful people in the community were protecting Rachel's abductor. She filled notebook after notebook with her own investigative theories, connecting seemingly random events and coincidences into elaborate webs of suspicion that alienated friends and neighbors who had initially rallied to support the family. Sleep became Linda's enemy. She would lie awake, listening for the sound of Rachel's footsteps on the front porch, or the familiar creak of her daughter's bedroom door. The house felt simultaneously too empty and too full of memories. Rachel's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it, her homework still spread across her desk, her collection of veterinary medicine textbooks stacked beside her bed, her acceptance letter to UC Davis tucked between the pages of her diary. Linda would sometimes sit on Rachel's bed for hours, inhaling the fading scent of her daughter's favorite perfume that still lingered on the pillowcase. The town itself seemed to age prematurely under the shadow of the unsolved case. Miller's Diner changed ownership 3 times before finally closing permanently in 1987, its windows boarded up and parking lot cracked with weeds growing through the asphalt. Highway 180 was widened and repaved, erasing the physical evidence of that October night, but the psychological scars remained deeply embedded in the community's collective memory. Parents who had been teenagers when Rachel disappeared now warned their own children about the dangers that lurked in seemingly safe places, creating a generation raised on hypervigilance and inherited fear. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, Rachel's case became a cautionary tale told in whispers, a reminder that evil could strike anywhere without warning or explanation. New missing persons cases in other parts of California would prompt desperate phone calls from Linda Brown, who had memorized the details of every unsolved disappearance in the state, searching for patterns that might finally provide answers about what happened to her daughter on that dark night, when innocence vanished into the vast emptiness of the Central Valley. Detective Maria Santos inherited her desk at the Fresno County Sheriff's Department, along with 4 filing cabinets filled with cold cases that stretched back nearly 4 decades. their manila folders yellowed with age and their contents representing hundreds of families still waiting for closure. The Rachel Brown file sat in the bottom drawer of the second cabinet, wedged between a 1977 armed robbery and a 1981 hit-and-run, its thickness indicating the countless hours of investigative work that had yielded frustratingly few results. Santos had requested assignment to the cold case unit specifically because she believed that advances in forensic science and investigative techniques could finally provide answers to families who had been living in limbo for decades. The Brown case caught her attention not because of what the file contained, but because of what seemed to be missing. Santos spread the contents across her desk late one evening in November 2018, studying crime scene photographs that had been taken with outdated equipment and reviewing witness statements that raised more questions than they answered. The investigation had been thorough by 1979 standards, but Santos recognized numerous opportunities where modern techniques could potentially uncover evidence that had been overlooked or deemed irrelevant 40 years earlier. She made a list of every witness who had been interviewed, cross-referencing their names against current addresses and phone numbers, determined to re-examine the case with fresh eyes and updated methodology. Her first breakthrough came when she contacted Sarah Martinez, now Sarah Lombardi, who had moved to Phoenix but still carried the guilt of being the last person to see Rachel alive. Over the phone, Sarah's voice trembled as she recounted details she had never shared with the original investigators, memories that had been suppressed by trauma and the passage of time. She remembered seeing a large pickup truck parked at the far end of Miller's Diner parking lot that night, its occupant sitting motionless behind the wheel as she and Rachel talked inside the restaurant. The detail had seemed insignificant at the time, but Sarah now realized the vehicle had been positioned with a clear view of Rachel's Honda Civic. Santos drove to Phoenix to interview Sarah in person, recognizing that face-to-face conversation often yielded information that phone calls could not. Sarah's kitchen table was covered with photographs from her high school years, images of her friendship with Rachel that had been too painful to display for decades. As Sarah looked through the pictures, she suddenly stopped at a photograph taken at a school carnival just weeks before Rachel's disappearance. In the background, barely visible, was the same large pickup truck she remembered from the diner parking lot, and behind the wheel sat a man whose face was partially obscured by shadows, but whose distinctive profile Sarah now realized she had seen before. The detective spent months tracking down other witnesses from 1979, many of whom had moved away from Fresno County but retained vivid memories of the investigation that had dominated local news for months. A retired trucker named Peterson recalled seeing a vehicle matching the pickup's description pulled over on the shoulder of Highway 180 around midnight on October 15th, but he had been dealing with his own mechanical problems and hadn't thought to report the sighting. A former diner employee remembered a customer who had made her uncomfortable with his persistent questions about the young women who frequented the restaurant, particularly their work schedules and dating relationships. Santos compiled these new details into a comprehensive timeline that revealed gaps in the original investigation. The lack of proper crime scene photography had meant that crucial evidence might have been overlooked or contaminated. Witness statements had been taken hastily, without follow-up interviews that might have revealed inconsistencies or additional details. Most significantly, physical evidence that had been deemed unimportant in 1979 was now potentially valuable thanks to advances in DNA analysis and forensic science. The detective's methodical approach began to reveal a pattern that had been invisible to the original investigators. The pickup truck sightings weren't random coincidences, but suggested premeditation and surveillance. Someone had been watching Rachel, studying her routines, and waiting for the right opportunity to strike. Santos realized that solving this case would require not just modern forensic techniques, but a complete reconstruction of events based on evidence that had been gathering dust for nearly 4 decades. She submitted a request to the district attorney's office for permission to reopen the Rachel Brown investigation, knowing that success would require resources the department had been reluctant to commit to cold cases. But something about this particular file had captured her imagination, and she was determined to give the Brown family the answers they had been seeking for almost 40 years. The evidence storage facility in the basement of the Fresno County Sheriff's Department resembled an archaeological dig site, with boxes of physical evidence stacked floor to ceiling in chronological order, each container representing someone's worst day, preserved in sterile plastic bags and manila envelopes. Detective Santos navigated the narrow aisles with a flashlight, searching for evidence box number 792847, which contained the physical remnants of Rachel Brown's final night. The musty air carried the scent of old paper and forgotten hopes, while fluorescent bulbs flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across decades of unsolved mysteries. The box itself was smaller than Santos had expected, containing just 17 items that had been carefully catalogued and stored according to 1979 protocols. Rachel's purse, her car keys, soil samples from the parking lot, and photographs of tire tracks that had long since been washed away by 40 years of California weather. But tucked into the bottom corner was evidence bag 792847M, containing a piece of blue denim fabric that had been found 3 weeks after Rachel's disappearance, snagged on a barbed wire fence nearly half a mile from Miller's Diner. The fabric had been tested for blood evidence in 1979, but the primitive techniques available at the time had been inconclusive, and the sample had been filed away and forgotten. Santos held the evidence bag up to the light, studying the torn piece of material that measured roughly 3 inches by 2 inches. The fabric showed signs of having been forcibly torn, with loose threads that suggested it had been ripped away during a struggle. More importantly, dark stains on one corner of the material had never been properly analyzed using modern forensic techniques. The original investigators had assumed the stains were blood from Rachel herself, but advances in DNA analysis now made it possible to determine not just whether the stains contained human blood, but whose blood it was, and whether multiple people had contributed to the sample. The California Department of Justice Forensic Laboratory in Richmond had developed new extraction techniques specifically designed for degraded biological samples, and Santos personally drove the evidence bag north on Interstate 5, treating it like the precious cargo it represented. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the lab's chief DNA analyst, explained that genetic material could survive for decades under the right conditions, and the dry climate of the Central Valley, combined with the protective plastic storage, had potentially preserved enough biological evidence to generate a usable DNA profile. The extraction process took 3 weeks, with multiple attempts required to isolate genetic material from the contaminated fabric sample. Dr. Walsh called Santos on a Friday afternoon in March 2019 with news that would reshape the entire investigation. The dark stains contained DNA from 2 different individuals, one female profile that matched Rachel Brown's known DNA from her hairbrush, and a second profile from an unidentified male. The male DNA was incomplete, showing degradation consistent with its age, but contained enough genetic markers to potentially identify a suspect if his DNA was already in the national database system. Santos felt her pulse quicken as Dr. Walsh explained that the male DNA profile had been run through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that contained millions of genetic profiles from convicted criminals and unsolved cases across the United States. The search had returned no matches, meaning Rachel's killer had either never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA submission, or had committed his crime before DNA collection became standard practice in the criminal justice system. But the profile was complete enough for what Dr. Walsh called investigative genetic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that used public DNA databases to identify suspects through their family connections. The implications were staggering. After 40 years of dead ends and false leads, the investigation had finally uncovered scientific evidence that could potentially identify Rachel's killer. The torn piece of denim fabric had been waiting in that evidence box like a time capsule, preserving the genetic fingerprint of a predator who had believed his crime would never be solved. Santos stared at the DNA profile printout, a series of numbers and letters that represented the most significant breakthrough in the case since Rachel's car had been found empty in Miller's Diner parking lot 4 decades earlier. Dr. Amanda Keller worked from a cluttered office in Sacramento that resembled a cross between a genealogy research center and a high-tech laboratory, with computer monitors displaying complex family trees alongside DNA analysis software that could trace genetic connections across multiple generations. As one of California's leading experts in investigative genetic genealogy, Keller had helped solve dozens of cold cases by using public DNA databases to identify suspects through their distant relatives, a technique that had revolutionized criminal investigations across the country. When Detective Santos contacted her about the Rachel Brown case, Keller immediately recognized the potential for a breakthrough that could finally provide answers to a family that had been waiting for justice for nearly 4 decades. The process began with uploading the unknown male DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public database where people voluntarily submitted their genetic information to research family connections and genealogical history. Within hours, the system identified potential relatives of the unknown suspect, ranging from distant cousins who shared small segments of DNA to closer family members who showed more significant genetic overlap. Keller explained to Santos that the technique worked like a reverse family tree, starting with the suspect's DNA and working backwards through generations to identify common ancestors, then forward again to find living relatives who might lead to the perpetrator's identity. The initial results showed connections to several family lines that had deep roots in California's Central Valley, with surnames like Hoffman, Weber, and Bauer appearing repeatedly in the genetic matches. Keller spent weeks building detailed family trees for each potential connection, using public records, obituaries, census data, and social media profiles to trace the movements and locations of hundreds of individuals across multiple generations. The work required patience and methodical attention to detail, as each genetic match had to be thoroughly investigated and either eliminated or pursued further based on geographic and temporal connections to the crime. One family line showed particularly promising results. The genetic matches pointed to descendants of German immigrants who had settled in Fresno County in the 1920s, establishing farms and businesses that had remained in the family for generations. Keller traced the family tree through birth records, marriage certificates, and property deeds, identifying a cluster of male relatives who would have been of appropriate age to commit the crime in 1979. The genealogical research revealed that several members of this family line had worked in transportation-related industries, including trucking and delivery services, which correlated with witness descriptions of the suspicious pickup truck seen at Miller's Diner. As the family tree grew more detailed, 3 specific individuals emerged as potential suspects. Each man had been living in the Central Valley in 1979, was between the ages of 25 and 45 at the time of Rachel's disappearance, and had access to vehicles that matched witness descriptions. Keller cross-referenced their known addresses with the locations where Rachel had worked and socialized, looking for intersections that might explain how the killer had become aware of her routines and vulnerabilities. The research revealed disturbing patterns of geographic overlap, with all three suspects having lived or worked within a 10-mile radius of Miller's Diner during the relevant time period. Detective Santos felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation as the investigation narrowed towards specific individuals who had been living normal lives in their community for 40 years while harboring the secret of Rachel Brown's murder. The genetic genealogy had transformed an impossible case into a manageable investigation, but it also raised complex questions about privacy, surveillance, and the implications of using family DNA to identify criminal suspects. Each potential perpetrator would need to be approached carefully, with surveillance and evidence collection that could definitively link them to the crime without alerting them to the investigation. The digital detective work had created a roadmap toward justice, but Santos realized that the most dangerous phase of the investigation was just beginning. Somewhere in Fresno County, a man who had believed he had committed the perfect crime was about to discover that advances in forensic science had finally caught up with his 40-year-old secret. The genetic evidence that had been preserved in that torn piece of denim would either vindicate an innocent person or expose a killer who'd been hiding in plain sight among the very community he had terrorized on that October night in 1979. The Hoffman family tree stretched across Dr. Keller's computer screen like a digital spiderweb, connecting dozens of names, dates, and locations through genetic markers that had remained hidden for generations until technology finally made their relationships visible. At the center of the web sat three potential suspects, each represented by a small box containing basic biographical information that would determine whether Detective Santos was finally closing in on Rachel Brown's killer or pursuing another dead end in a case that had already consumed too many years of false hope and shattered expectations. The first suspect, Robert Hoffman, had worked as a mechanic in Fresno during the late 1970s, but had moved to Oregon shortly after Rachel's disappearance, a geographic relocation that initially seemed suspicious until further research revealed he had been caring for his dying mother in Portland. The second candidate, James Hoffman, had been employed by a local construction company and matched the age profile perfectly. But military records showed he had been stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, during October 1979, serving his country while Rachel Brown was being murdered 3,000 miles away. The third name on the list made Detective Santos's pulse quicken as she read through the preliminary background information. David Hoffman, born March 15, 1953, had been 26 years old when Rachel disappeared, working as a long-haul truck driver for Central Valley Transport, a company that hauled agricultural products throughout California's farming regions. His employment records showed regular routes along Highway 180, the same stretch of road where Rachel had vanished, and his personnel file contained multiple citations for speeding and aggressive driving behavior that had nearly cost him his commercial license. Santos spent a sleepless night poring over David Hoffman's background, building a comprehensive profile that revealed a man who had lived his entire life within 50 miles of the crime scene. He had graduated from Clovis High School in 1971, just 2 years before Rachel was born, and had worked a series of blue-collar jobs before settling into truck driving, a profession that provided both mobility and anonymity. His driving record showed a pattern of violations concentrated around the Highway 180 corridor, including 3 separate incidents where he had been stopped for following female motorists too closely, behavior that had been dismissed as road rage but now seemed potentially more sinister. The investigative focus shifted to surveillance, with Santos coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies to monitor David Hoffman without alerting him to their interest. At 67 years old, he still lived in Clovis, just 15 miles from Miller's Diner, in a modest ranch-style house that he had purchased in 1985. Neighbors described him as a friendly but reserved man who kept to himself, maintained an immaculate lawn, and drove a pristine 1995 Ford pickup truck that he washed every Saturday morning with obsessive attention to detail. Public records revealed that David Hoffman had never married, had no children, and had maintained steady employment at various trucking companies until his retirement in 2018. His social media presence was minimal, limited to a Facebook account with fewer than 20 friends and occasional posts about classic car shows and local high school football games. To the outside world, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a retired working man who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in the same community for nearly 7 decades. But Detective Santos had learned to look beyond surface appearances, and the deeper she dug into David Hoffman's background, the more concerning details emerged. His employment history showed frequent job changes, usually following complaints from female co-workers about inappropriate behavior or unwanted attention. In 1987, police report documented a restraining order filed by a woman named Patricia Riley, who claimed Hoffman had followed her home from work and lingered outside her apartment building for hours. The charges had been dropped when Riley moved to another state, but the incident established a pattern of predatory behavior that predated Rachel's disappearance. The genetic evidence pointed directly to David Hoffman, but Santos needed additional proof that would satisfy a jury and provide the Brown family with the definitive answers they had been seeking for 40 years. The investigation had reached its most critical phase, where speculation would either be confirmed by hard evidence or collapse under the weight of reasonable doubt. The morning of March 12, 2020, dawned clear and cold across Fresno County, with a thin layer of frost covering the carefully maintained lawns of suburban Clovis, as Detective Santos sat in an unmarked sedan 3 blocks from David Hoffman's residence, her breath visible in the chilly air as she coordinated the final details of an arrest that would either solve a 40-year-old mystery or destroy an innocent man's reputation forever. The surveillance team had been watching Hoffman for 6 weeks, documenting his predictable routines and establishing that he posed no flight risk. But Santos felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that accompanied every major arrest in her career. At 6:47 a.m., Hoffman emerged from his house, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the same grey windbreaker he donned every morning for his walk around the neighborhood. A ritual that had remained unchanged for years, according to neighbors who had grown accustomed to seeing the elderly man shuffling along their quiet streets. Santos gave the signal to her backup units, and within minutes, unmarked police vehicles had positioned themselves at strategic locations around the block, creating an invisible perimeter that would prevent any chance of escape or confrontation. The arrest itself was anticlimactic, unfolding with the methodical precision of a well-rehearsed operation rather than the dramatic confrontation Santos had imagined. Hoffman was returning from his walk when Detective Santos approached him on the sidewalk in front of his house, her badge visible and her voice steady as she identified herself and informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Rachel Brown. The name seemed to hit him like a physical blow, his coffee cup slipping from his fingers and shattering on the concrete as his face drained of color and his knees buckled slightly. The neighbors who witnessed the arrest would later describe their shock at seeing David Hoffman, the man they had known for decades as a helpful neighbor and community volunteer, being placed in handcuffs and led away by police officers. Mrs. Angela Torres, who lived next door, had borrowed gardening tools from Hoffman countless times and had never felt anything but safe in his presence. She stood on her front porch in her bathrobe, watching in disbelief as the man who had helped her carry groceries and had coached her grandson's Little League team was placed in the back of a police cruiser. Hoffman's own reaction to the arrest was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire operation. Rather than protesting his innocence or demanding to know what evidence police had against him, he sat silently in the back seat of the patrol car, staring straight ahead with an expression that Detective Santos would later describe as relief rather than surprise. It was the look of a man who had been carrying an unbearable secret for 40 years and was almost grateful that the burden was finally being lifted from his shoulders. The search of Hoffman's house revealed a meticulously organized life that bordered on obsessive-compulsive behavior, with every item in its designated place and every surface scrubbed clean. But hidden in the back of his bedroom closet, tucked inside an old toolbox, investigators found a collection of newspaper clippings about Rachel Brown's disappearance, dating from 1979 through the most recent anniversary articles. The clippings had been carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, organized chronologically, and annotated with handwritten notes that would later prove crucial to understanding Hoffman's psychological state during the years following the murder. More disturbing were the photographs police discovered in the same toolbox, dozens of images of young women taken from a distance without their knowledge, apparently captured as Hoffman went about his daily routines throughout Fresno County. The photos spanned decades and showed women at gas stations, shopping centers, restaurants, and other public locations, all apparently unaware that they were being watched and photographed by a predator who had perfected the art of blending into the background of suburban life. As word of the arrest spread through the community, residents struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster who had allegedly committed one of the area's most notorious crimes. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for people who had trusted Hoffman with their children, invited him to neighborhood barbecues, and considered him a pillar of their quiet community. The revelation that evil could hide behind such an ordinary facade would haunt Clovis for years to come, forcing residents to question everything they thought they knew about safety, trust, and the true nature of the people living among them. The news of David Hoffman's arrest spread through Clovis like wildfire on a dry summer day, crackling from house to house through phone calls, text messages, and hastily organized conversations over backyard fences as neighbors struggled to process the reality that a suspected killer had been living among them for decades. The Safeway grocery store, where Hoffman had shopped every Tuesday for 20 years, became an impromptu gathering place where residents shared their disbelief and recounted interactions that suddenly seemed ominous in retrospect. Cashier Maria Gonzalez remembered how Hoffman always paid in exact change and never made eye contact, behavior she had attributed to shyness, but now recognized as the calculated detachment of someone hiding a terrible secret. The psychological impact on the community was immediate and profound, as residents grappled with the terrifying realization that their most fundamental assumptions about safety and trust had been built on an illusion. Parents who had allowed their teenagers to earn spending money by helping Hoffman with yard work now lay awake at night, wondering what might have happened if their children had been alone with him. The local Little League Association held emergency meetings to discuss Hoffman's decade-long involvement as a volunteer coach, reviewing old team photographs and trying to remember whether any children had ever seemed uncomfortable around the man who had taught them to throw curveballs and slide safely into home plate. Detective Santos spent the first 48 hours after Hoffman's arrest fielding calls from community members who suddenly remembered interactions that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried sinister implications. A woman named Jennifer Clark recalled how Hoffman had offered to fix her car in 1995, insisting on working alone in her garage while she remained inside the house, a kindness that now seemed like reconnaissance for a potential attack. Another neighbor remembered how Hoffman had always seemed to know when she was traveling for work, appearing at her door with offers to collect her mail and water her plants with an eagerness that she had mistaken for community spirit. The interrogation room at the Fresno County Sheriff's Department became the stage for a confession that would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. Hoffman's demeanor during questioning was disturbing in its matter-of-fact calmness, as if he were discussing the weather rather than describing the brutal murder of a 17-year-old girl. He spoke about watching Rachel for weeks before the attack, learning her routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. His voice never wavered as he described following her from Miller's diner, forcing her into his truck and driving to a remote location where he had assaulted and killed her before disposing of her body in an irrigation canal that had since been filled in and developed into a shopping center. The details of Hoffman's confession were so specific and disturbing that Detective Santos had to excuse herself from the interview room twice, overwhelmed by the clinical precision with which he described destroying a young woman's life and dreams. He spoke about Rachel's final moments with the detached observation of someone describing a scientific experiment, noting how she had begged for her life and promised to keep his identity secret if he would just let her go home to her parents. The recording of the confession would be sealed from public release, but its contents spread through law enforcement circles like a psychological contagion, leaving experienced investigators questioning their faith in humanity. Perhaps most unsettling was Hoffman's explanation for why he had kept the newspaper clippings about the case for 4 decades. He described reading each anniversary article with satisfaction, taking pride in how thoroughly he had covered his tracks and how completely he had fooled the investigators who had worked the case. The annual vigils organized by Linda Brown had been particularly gratifying to him, as he would sometimes drive past Miller's diner during the memorials and watch Rachel's mother holding candles and pleading for answers that he could have provided with a single phone call. The community's attempt to process this information created a collective trauma that would require years of healing. Local churches organized counseling sessions for residents who had known Hoffman personally, while the school district brought in crisis intervention specialists to help students understand how someone they had trusted could be capable of such evil. The Fresno County Superior Court had never seen a packed gallery quite like the one that assembled for David Hoffman's sentencing hearing on a humid September morning in 2020, with survivors of other unsolved cases sitting alongside Rachel Brown's extended family and community members who had followed the investigation for 4 decades. Linda Brown, now 89 years old and walking with a cane, took her place in the front row, wearing the same blue dress she had worn to Rachel's high school graduation ceremony 41 years earlier, her weathered hands clutching a photograph of her daughter that had been taken just days before the murder. Judge Patricia Sullivan presided over proceedings with the gravity befitting a case that had haunted an entire region for nearly half a century, her voice steady as she read the charges and reviewed the overwhelming evidence that had finally brought Rachel's killer to justice. The courtroom fell silent as Detective Santos presented the timeline of the investigation, from the initial search in 1979 through the genetic genealogy breakthrough that had identified Hoffman as the perpetrator. The scientific evidence was irrefutable, linking Hoffman's DNA to the crime scene through advanced forensic techniques that had been unimaginable when Rachel first disappeared. Hoffman himself sat at the defense table with the same unsettling calm he had displayed during his confession, showing no visible emotion as the prosecution detailed the brutality of his crime and its devastating impact on the Brown family. His court-appointed attorney had advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than force Linda Brown to endure the trauma of a lengthy trial, but Hoffman had insisted on maintaining his innocence until the very end, perhaps unable to fully acknowledge the monster he had been, or perhaps simply enjoying one final opportunity to inflict pain on the family he had already destroyed. The victim impact statements created some of the most emotionally charged moments in Fresno County legal history, as Linda Brown rose slowly from her seat and approached the microphone with the determination of someone who had been waiting decades for this opportunity to speak directly to her daughter's killer. Her voice, though frail with age, carried across the courtroom with startling clarity as she described the 41 years of sleepless nights, the birthdays and holidays that had been forever tainted by grief, and the slow disintegration of her marriage under the weight of unresolved loss. She spoke about Rachel's dreams of becoming a veterinarian, the college acceptance letter that had remained unopened for decades, and the grandchildren she would never have the chance to meet. Sarah Martinez, now Sarah Lombardi, traveled from Phoenix to deliver her own statement, describing the survivor's guilt that had haunted her since that October night when she had watched her best friend walk into the darkness. She spoke about the therapy sessions, the failed relationships, and the recurring nightmares that had plagued her for 4 decades, all because she had been the last person to see Rachel alive and had been powerless to prevent the tragedy that followed. Her voice broke as she addressed Hoffman directly, telling him that his crime had not just taken Rachel's life, but had stolen the innocence and security from everyone who loved her. Judge Sullivan's sentencing reflected the gravity of the crime and the decades of suffering it had caused, condemning Hoffman to life in prison without the possibility of parole and ordering him to pay restitution to the Brown family for the private investigators and legal fees they had incurred during their long search for justice. The judge noted that advances in forensic science had finally made it possible to solve crimes that previous generations of investigators could never have resolved, offering hope to other families still waiting for answers about their own missing loved ones. As Hoffman was led away in shackles, Linda Brown felt a complex mixture of relief and emptiness that surprised her with its intensity. The man who had haunted her dreams for 41 years was finally being held accountable for his crime. But Rachel was still gone, and no amount of justice could restore the life that had been stolen from her daughter or the decades of normalcy that had been taken from her family. Detective Santos approached Linda after the sentencing, promising that the investigation would continue to determine whether Hoffman might have been responsible for other unsolved disappearances in the Central Valley, cases that had been overshadowed by Rachel's story, but deserved the same dedication to finding truth and justice. If you're following this case or others like it, consider subscribing to stay updated on how modern forensic science continues to solve cold cases that once seemed impossible to crack, bringing closure to families who never gave up hope that justice would eventually prevail.